He maintained his innocence until his very last breath. Marcellus Williams was executed by lethal injection Tuesday, despite the objections of prosecutors and the family of the woman he was convicted of murdering.
My dad was away from me for 25 years, and then he was murdered here.
Williams spent more than 2 decades on Missouri's death row for the 1998 murder of Felicia Gale, who was found stabbed in her St. Louis home. 2 previous executions were called off after questions emerged about the original trial, including DNA tests of the murder weapon, which did not link back to Williams, and bias in jury selection.
Please be seated.
Which was brought up again during a last-minute state Supreme Court appeal this week.
The trial prosecutor in Marcellus Williams' case has admitted under oath that he struck a juror in part because of his race.
The shadow of doubt cast over Williams' guilt and his willingness to accept life in prison instead of death were not enough. Both the Missouri and U.S. Supreme Courts declined to intervene. In Washington, the 3 liberal justices said they would have granted a stay. They were overruled by the conservative majority. Missouri's governor rejected Williams' final plea for clemency.
And basically, Mr. Williams is going to be killed because the government mishandled this evidence.
No juror nor judge has ever found Williams' innocence claim to be credible.
Civil rights leaders call it a state-sponsored lynching, while prosecutors said Williams' death did not serve the interests of justice.
And Vugu Nayosi, Black Revolutionary Now. Just wanted to bring you this story on Marcellus Williams, who was on death row for over 2 decades. And what made this story so interesting is when you look at the evidence, you clearly see this was an innocent man. How so? When you look at the victim family, when you look at the jurors, and when you look at the office that prosecute Mr. Williams, they all oppose his execution. When you look at the evidence of him being on the crime scene, his DNA on the murder weapon, his DNA was nowhere to be found. So you had the victim family and the office that prosecute Mr. Williams was saying, hold up here, we need to look at something. And the governor of Missouri still proceeded to execute an innocent man. This is white supremacy 101. And we see in our history a lot of black people have been executed for just being black. And also, one of the jurors was found out that he had racial bias against Marcellus Williams. So when you look at all the evidence compiled in this particular case, you will see that the state of Missouri clearly executed an innocent man. And this is our story. This is what our people have been going through. 14-year-old George Stinney who was executed. Executed in a chair that was meant for grown people. And if you never know about the story or heard about the story of George Stinney, please go and look it up. But I'll give you this little background. He was 14 years old, playing with his sister outside in the yard. And they were approached by two young white girls, I think like 11, I think it was 9 and 11 or 9 and 12 or something like that. And they were asking, they asked him some question, and that was the only interaction they actually had with 14-year-old George Stinney. I think the two girls was looking for something in the neighborhood, and they just approached George Stinney and his sister and just asked him something, and just on the way. And a few days after, their body were found murdered. And what made this case also interesting is the only circumstances, evidence they had in this case was those girls speaking to George Stinney. When you look at how they interrogate this 14-year-old child without his parents, without an attorney present, and they say that they forced him to confess to the murders, but there was no recording or no written statement, whatever. And a jury of 12 white people, and check this out, right, because this take place in 1944, they wasn't even allowing black people in the court building, in the building where the court, far less the courtroom. Black people wasn't even allowed in the building. And it took less than 3 hours, case and deliberation, to find 14-year-old George Stinney guilty. Wow. In 1944. And what's amazed me is that 70 years later, they finally prove that this child was innocent. He was innocent. And they put him in an electric chair that even the straps around his arm didn't fit. That is how small and tiny this 14-year-old child was. And they execute him in an electric chair and coerce him to make a false confession to say that he did it, even though there is no proof of it, because we all know how white supremacy works. I am white and I said so. So once the white man say that you did it, hey, we have to believe the white man, because the white man never tell no lie, right? the white men never cheat and rob and grape and pillage and genocide. No, he's all innocent of that. So we have to take his word for it. Right? So just wanted to bring you those two cases and just to show you when you look at cases like this that for the most part get shoved under the rug or get buried for years and decades, whatever. And we never heard about the names. And I'm sure victims of who they were accused of, I'm sure they have their pain and their grief or whatever. But what about Marcellus Williams and George Stinney family, relative? They are the victims too as well, because these are two cases of no evidence tying them to their crimes. Absolutely zero evidence. And this is what we have been dealing with from 1944 to 2024. Rest in power, George Stinney and Marcellus Williams. Peace and Black power, Black revolutionary now.